Welcome to Afritales by Sophyjay.
This is the story of a girl born different, Adaeze, the child with eyes as blue as the morning sky. In a land where such beauty was feared, her difference became her curse. They said she was a sign of evil, a spirit in human form, and even her own parents began to tremble at her presence. But destiny had a secret. The same eyes they called cursed carried the vision that would one day save them all. In this folktale, you will see how pain can shape purpose, how rejection can refine destiny, and how sometimes the very thing the world fears is what the world was waiting for. They said she was born on a morning when the clouds refused to move. The midwife, an old woman with trembling hands, had seen many births in her life, but none like this. When the baby opened her eyes for the first time, the room fell silent. They weren't brown or black like every other child's, they were bright blue, like sunlight trapped in water. For a moment, everyone stared in awe. But awe, in that small town called Adaeze, never lasted long before fear replaced it. Someone whispered, "These eyes are not ordinary." Another muttered, "She's not from here." And before the umbilical cord was even cut, they had already given her a name she didn't deserve, Noa Mumor, the spirit child. Her mother, Adaeze, tried to smile through the whispers, tried to hold her baby close, but even she felt her heartbeat stumble. Her eyes, she murmured, tracing the child's face with shaky fingers. Her husband, Okoro, stood by the door, eyes wide with confusion. He didn't step closer. The midwife said softly, "It's just a child," but the village women exchanged looks that said otherwise. By the time the baby's first cry echoed across the compound, the story had already left the room. A cursed child with blue eyes has been born in Adaeze. In the early months, Adaeze tried to raise her daughter like any other child, but the village would not let her. Wherever she carried the baby, people shifted away as if wind had pushed them. When Adaeze laughed, some said she was mocking the ancestors. When she cried, they said it was thunder warning the village. Mothers pulled their children indoors when they saw her coming. "Don't look at her eyes," they whispered. "They'll bring bad luck." The market women stopped buying from Adaeze's stall. The church women stopped visiting. Even at home, Okoro began to change. He no longer held his daughter. He avoided her gaze as if it burned. "Maybe we angered the gods," he told his wife one night, his voice tight with shame. Adaeze's eyes filled with tears. "She's just a baby," she said. But her words broke against a wall of fear. When Adaeze turned 4, the bullying began in full. Children mocked her in the streets, calling her Anye Muo, the ghost girl. They threw sand at her, laughed at the way she covered her face, and ran off screaming when she dared to smile. Even teachers looked uneasy when she entered the classroom. She sat alone at the back, tracing the words on her desk with chalk, pretending not to notice when others changed seats. Yet, for every cruelty she faced, there was still something in her that glowed quietly, a gentleness that no hatred could destroy. She fed stray goats, helped old women carry their baskets, and smiled at babies who didn't yet know to fear her. Some nights, she would look up at the sky and whisper, "Maybe there's another world where blue eyes aren't strange." But the stars never answered. By the time she turned 10, Adaeze had learned silence like a second language. She walked to school alone, sat in corners, and returned home to a house that had grown too quiet. Her mother still loved her, but even love had grown heavy with fear. Okoro had changed completely. He refused to let Adaeze touch his food or clothes. He began to tell people, "I warned her mother not to keep that child." When sickness visited the village, when rain delayed or a harvest failed, whispers always found their way back to their doorstep. "That blue-eyed girl is the reason," they said. The chief's wife claimed she saw Adaze's reflection in her dream the night her goat died. The local pastor said she should be prayed for from a distance. It didn't matter that Adaeze never hurt anyone. Her difference was enough to carry blame. The fear spread until even children younger than her crossed the road when they saw her coming. Still, she endured it all with quiet grace. But on her 11th birthday, she sat by the stream alone, watching her reflection tremble in the water. "Why did you make me this way?" she whispered to the sky. But the only reply was the croak of frogs and the distant hum of the village generator. Somewhere behind her, a group of boys watched from the trees. "Let's see if the spirit girl can cry," one of them said. They threw pebbles that splashed near her feet. Adaeze didn't look up. She only closed her eyes and hummed softly, a tune her mother used to sing before the world turned cruel. That day, her song carried farther than the stones. The older she grew, the more her blue eyes became a story told to frighten children. Parents used her name as a warning. "If you don't listen, Adaeze will appear in your dream." Some swore her shadow walked without her. Others said she had no shadow at all. Lies piled on lies until the truth of her kindness disappeared beneath them. But something else was happening quietly. Adaze's spirit was hardening, shaping itself like clay in fire. She began to see what others couldn't, the sadness in her mother's eyes, the guilt in her father's silence, the way fear could turn love into hatred. At 12, she stopped crying. She started writing small words in the sand behind her house, words she had picked up from old newspapers her mother used to wrap beans. Hope, light, tomorrow. Each letter felt like a rebellion. Then came the year the skies refused to rain. The sun burned longer than it should. Rivers shrank, farms cracked, and desperation spread. And once again, the whispers found her name. The rains failed that year. It began quietly, a week without clouds, then 2, then a month. At first, the people of Adaeze joked about it. The heavens are just resting, they said, laughing as they wiped sweat from their foreheads. But as the sun grew harder and the ground cracked open like broken pottery, laughter gave way to panic. The yam leaves turned yellow, streams thinned into trickles, and goats bleated in confusion, searching for water that was no longer there. The church bell rang every morning for prayers, and every evening for confession. Women gathered at the village square with buckets, waiting for tankers that never came. In the market, the smell of dust replaced that of pepper and fish. And somewhere in the middle of all that fear, an old voice whispered the words that would change Adaze's life forever. This drought began when the blue-eyed child entered our land. It spread like dry grass catching fire. The next day, the school teacher refused to let Adaeze into class, saying, "Until rain falls, stay at home." The pastor preached about hidden sins. The town crier beat his drum and spoke of cleansing the land. Each time Adaeze passed, people spat on the ground behind her, muttering prayers. Even her own father, Okoro, began to avoid her eyes completely. Her mother still tried to defend her, but her voice trembled more with each passing day. Fear had a way of making truth sound like a lie. By the 3rd month, the entire town was desperate. The river had dried into a shallow ditch where children used to swim. Farmers knelt on cracked soil, begging for a single drop of rain. Rumors began to take form like smoke. Some said Adaeze had been seen at the riverbank whispering to unseen spirits. Others swore that her eyes had turned the color of the sky just before thunder rolled, but no rain followed. The chief called a council of elders. They sat under the ancient Adala tree, faces glistening with sweat, muttering about signs and sacrifices. Adaze's name hung between them like a curse they were afraid to say too loud. Finally, one of them, an old man whose grandson had fallen sick, spoke. "Until the spirit that entered this village leaves, the heavens will not open." The crowd that had gathered shouted in agreement. Okoro sat among them, his head bowed low. Adaeze clutched her wrapper, shaking. "You all know my daughter," she cried. "She has never hurt anyone." But her words were drowned by a chant that rose like a storm. "Cleanse the land. Cleanse the land." The decision was made. At dawn, the town would gather to send Adaeze away. She was 12 years old. That night, Adaeze didn't sleep. She sat outside, watching the moonlight fall across the dry fields. She heard her parents arguing inside, her mother's voice breaking, her father's heavy silence. She knew what was coming. The world had been whispering it for years. She had lived long enough to understand that being different was a sentence she could never appeal. Still, she hoped foolishly, quietly, that someone might speak for her. That hope flickered out when her mother came out at dawn with red eyes and trembling hands. "They said you must go," Adaeze whispered. "If I fight them, they will hurt you." She tried to smile, but her lips refused to move. Adaeze looked at her, then at the rising sun behind her mother's shoulder. The light made her blue eyes glow faintly. "Will you come with me?" she asked softly. Adaeze shook her head. "If I go, they will call us both cursed." She pressed a small bag into her daughter's hands, a loaf of bread, a wrapper, and a bottle of water. "Go far, my child. Go where they don't know your name." Adaeze nodded. She wanted to say, "I love you," but the words got stuck behind the lump in her throat. When she turned to leave, her mother caught her hand and whispered, "You are not a curse. You are a miracle they were too blind to see." Then she let go. Adaeze walked through the village barefoot, her small figure framed by the orange light of morning. Doors opened silently as she passed. People peeked out, some in guilt, most in fear. Mothers pulled their children close. "Don't look at her eyes," they whispered. "She brings drought." When she reached the edge of the village, the elders stood waiting. One of them pointed at the dusty road ahead and said, "Do not return until the gods send rain." Adaeze nodded once. She didn't cry. She just looked up at the sky, the same sky they said she cursed, and whispered, "Let them see who truly brings the rain." Then she began to walk. The first few days were a blur of dust and hunger. Adaeze walked from one village to another, her bare feet bleeding, her throat dry. At every gate she stopped. People asked her name. When they heard it, they shut their doors. Some threw coins, others threw stones. At night, she slept beneath trees, listening to the sound of crickets and her own heartbeat. When it rained for a brief moment in one village, they called her a blessing. When lightning struck a tree the next day, they chased her out again. It was as if the world could not decide whether to love her or hate her. But in her solitude, something began to awaken, a quiet strength, the kind that is born only when the world stops caring. She learned how to beg with dignity, how to smile even when her stomach ached. Sometimes she found comfort in the smallest things, the song of a bird, the warmth of a stranger's leftover food, the way her reflection looked more determined every day. Her mother's words, "You are a miracle," became her heartbeat. Once, while resting by a roadside, a kind woman selling roasted corn asked, "Where are you going, little one?" Adaeze looked up and said simply, "Somewhere the sky understands me." The woman stared at her eyes for a long moment, then handed her 2 cobs without asking another question. That night, as Adaeze ate under the stars, she felt something shift inside her. Not bitterness, not anger, just resolve. The world might never understand her, but she would live anyway. And somehow, deep down, she knew this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the long walk toward who she was meant to become. Back in Umue, the day Adaeze left, clouds gathered for the first time in months. It started with a whisper of wind through the banana leaves, then a soft rumble that made even the elders look up. By evening, rain poured down in thick, angry sheets, soaking the parched earth and filling the empty wells. Children danced naked in the streets. Women lifted their hands to the sky, crying, "The gods have heard us." The chief declared a feast of thanksgiving. No one spoke of Adaeze. No one thanked her mother. They believed their sacrifice, her banishment, had appeased the heavens. But Azenne knew better. She stood by the window, watching the rain flood the compound, and whispered, "You see? Even the sky cries because she's gone." The rain washed away dust, guilt, and memory, but it could not wash away what the village had done. For years to come, they would call it the cleansing rain. They would never admit that it came not because Adaeze left, but because she was finally free. And somewhere beyond the hills, under another sky, the girl they cast out walked on, soaked, hungry, but unbroken. Her story, like the rain, was just beginning. For many weeks after the rain, Adaeze walked. The road unrolled before her like a test she never signed up for. Red dust, blinding sun, villages that all looked the same. Her sandals broke the first week. She tied the straps together with grass and kept moving. Sometimes she followed distant laughter just to remember what joy sounded like. Every new place began with the same hope and ended with the same door closing. In Ihiala, a woman gave her water but crossed herself after noticing the color of her eyes. In Mbieri, a palm wine tapper shouted that she was a sign of the end times. In one town, a group of children circled her, chanting a rhyme they'd made up. Blue eyes, blue lies, spirits in disguise. She learned to keep her head down and move quickly. Nights were worse, the world too quiet, memories too loud. When she lay under trees, she imagined her mother's voice in the rustling leaves. Hunger taught her humility, loneliness taught her patience. Yet beneath all the weariness, something inside her kept whispering, "Survive, keep walking." By the time she reached the outskirts of the city, Adaeze was thin as a broomstick, but her gaze was steady. Two bright fires that refused to go out. The city was louder than anything she had ever known. Cars honking, hawkers shouting, radios fighting for attention. Nobody cared who she was or where she came from. To them, she was just another face in the crowd. For the first time, her blue eyes didn't make people step back. They barely noticed them. That anonymity felt like mercy. She slept near a mechanic workshop the first night, wrapped in her old wrapper, listening to the metallic lullaby of spanners hitting bolts. A cleaner at a nearby restaurant found her the next morning, and moved by pity, gave her leftover rice and an old mop. "If you can clean, you can stay," the woman said. So Adaeze began working, sweeping floors, scrubbing tables, fetching water. Each naira she earned went toward bread and soap. The customers teased her accent. The manager shouted often. Still, she never complained. In the quiet hours after closing, she would sit by the doorway, tracing letters from discarded newspapers. Words fascinated her. They were like keys to invisible rooms. When she could finally read a full sentence, she smiled for the first time in months. "Knowledge," she whispered, "is water that never runs dry." It became her prayer. Months slipped into years. Adaeze moved from the restaurant to a small printing press, trading her mop for ink-stained papers. The owner, a patient man with spectacles, noticed her curiosity. "You like to learn?" he asked. She nodded. He began teaching her how to align type, mix colors, fold pamphlets. Soon she was setting paragraphs, designing flyers, correcting spelling mistakes. Every new skill felt like a piece of herself returning. On Sundays, she read discarded magazines aloud to other workers who couldn't read. Her voice carried confidence that surprised even her. She saved her wages carefully, and when she had enough, she rented a corner room behind the press. It was small, but it was hers. A space where she could light a candle, write in peace, and stare out the window at the city lights that looked like fallen stars. Sometimes she wondered if anyone in Umue still remembered her. The thought no longer hurt. It simply reminded her of how far she'd come. She had been called a curse, yet everything she touched now grew. Skills, people, hope. The same eyes they feared were now helping her see possibilities others missed. One evening, while walking home, Adaeze saw a group of street children fighting over a half-eaten loaf. Without thinking, she bought fresh bread from a nearby stall and split it among them. Their smiles lit something deep inside her. She began returning every evening, telling them stories, teaching letters with chalk on broken walls. Soon, others joined, hawkers, cleaners, market women who'd never been to school. Her tiny lessons became gatherings. If the world rejects you, she told them, build your own doorway. Donations trickled in. The printing press owner helped her register a small foundation. Adaeze had gone from wandering to belonging, from silence to influence. Yet she remained humble, still sweeping her classroom floor before every lesson, still whispering prayers for her mother under her breath. She didn't know that her name would soon travel farther than the wind, or that the same people who once banished her would one day wait in line to shake her hand. All she knew was that life, like rain, sometimes takes the longest road before it falls. The years moved quietly, like a song hummed under breath. Adaeze had become a familiar name in the city, first whispered in markets, then spoken proudly in schools, finally printed on banners that read "The Light of the Forgotten." What began as chalk lessons for street children had grown into evening classes for traders, bus conductors, and housemates. The woman who once hid her eyes now stood before crowds, her voice steady, her gaze clear. "You can start from dust and still become a garden," she would tell them, and people believed her because she spoke as someone who had eaten dust and turned it into bread. Volunteers joined her, churches donated benches. One television crew filmed her classes and aired the story. "Rejected girl turns hope for the poor." The clip spread faster than gossip. Viewers cried, shared, prayed for her. For the first time, Adaeze realized the weight of her own name. It had stopped being a wound. It had become a key. With every step forward, memories of Adaeze lingered at the edges of her heart. Sometimes when rain began to fall, she would pause at her window, remembering the morning she walked away barefoot. She wondered if the river had filled again, if her mother was still alive to see the clouds. But she never spoke of her past. Pain had become her private tutor. Instead, she poured all that memory into work. Her foundation, small at first, expanded into a network of community centers. They taught reading, sewing, carpentry, and basic business. Government officials began to notice. Some tried to take credit, others offered support. One afternoon, the city's mayor visited unannounced. He found her teaching a group of women how to sign their names instead of thumbprinting. "Madam, people talk about your work," he said. "Have you ever thought of running for office?" Adaeze laughed. "Sir, I only run after dreams," but his words stuck. That night, while writing her lesson plans, she whispered, "Maybe it's time to lead from a higher place." It felt absurd, her, the girl they once banished, thinking about leadership. Yet deep down, she knew that true change needed more than classrooms. It needed courage that carried light into power. The following year, Adaeze ran for the regional council seat. The campaign was modest. No expensive posters, no empty promises, just truth. She spoke at motor parks and markets and churches, her voice echoing across tin roofs and crowded streets. "I know what it means to be unseen," she said. "I've slept under bridges, begged for food, and still found reason to believe in tomorrow. Let's make tomorrow easier for those coming after us." Her sincerity disarmed even cynics. On election day, long queues formed. Women came with babies tied to their backs. Men came straight from workshops, grease on their hands. When results were announced, Adaeze had won by a landslide. The crowd outside the collation center erupted. Chants of "Adaeze, Adaeze" filled the air like a hymn. She stood on a wooden stage that night, rain drizzling softly, and whispered, "Mama, I did not fail you." That clip went viral across the country. For weeks, her story trended as #Blue Eyes of Hope. Interviews followed, invitations came, but she remained grounded. Her first act as a leader was to expand rural education and healthcare. Her second was to establish grants for women traders. When asked by a reporter what inspired her policies, she said, "Pain taught me empathy, and empathy built these plans." The nation fell in love with her honesty. Within a few years, Adaze's work reshaped the region. Roads reached forgotten villages, boreholes brought clean water. Girls who once carried basins now carried books. She visited communities where even radio signals had never reached, listening more than speaking, building more than boasting. But wherever she went, children ran to her, not away from her. Mothers held her hands and prayed blessings over her. People began to call her Nile, mother of all. But Adaeze never forgot the name that started it all, the one whispered in fear back in Adaeze. She carried it like a seed, waiting for the right season to plant it back where it first died. That season was drawing near. Letters began arriving from distant villages requesting her help with projects. One day, she opened an envelope stamped Adaeze Development Union. Her fingers trembled. The letter inside was simple. "Honorable Adaeze, we humbly invite you to visit your birthplace. The people wish to welcome you and seek your assistance." For a long time she stared at it, tears gathering quietly. After all the years, the same soil that once spat her out was calling her home. She smiled sadly and whispered, "Even stones can learn how to say sorry." She knew the journey back would not just rebuild a village, it would complete her story. The convoy slowed as it reached the edge of Adaeze. What used to be a narrow bush road was now tarred and lined with electric poles, yet the air still smelled of palm wine and red earth. Children in crisp uniforms stood on both sides waving small flags that read, "Welcome home Adaeze." Drums thumped from the square. The same talking drums that once warned of her birth were now singing her praise. From inside the car, Adaeze watched the faces blur past, faces older, softer, humbled by time. She had imagined this day 1,000 times, but never like this. Her palms trembled slightly. Her blue eyes shimmered in the sunlight that filtered through the window. When the car stopped, she stepped out slowly. The crowd gasped, not because of fear this time, but wonder. The girl they had called Nuamu had returned, dressed in white lace and peace. A hush swept through the gathering before the drummers found a new rhythm, joyful, tear-stained, unstoppable. Even the wind seemed to pause as she walked toward the square, each step erasing an old lie. At the center of the crowd, the chief waited, his staff shaking in his hands. Behind him stood elders who had once voted for her exile. Beside them, women who had whispered her name as a curse. No one spoke until the chief fell to his knees. "My daughter," he began, his voice breaking, "forgive us. We were blind, and fear made us foolish." One by one, others knelt, farmers, traders, even children who had never met her, but had grown up hearing the story. Tears blurred Adaeze's sight. She tried to speak, but emotion caught her tongue. Finally, she said, "Please stand. I did not come to judge you. I came because home is still home, even when it forgets you." Her words rippled through the air like rain returning to thirsty soil. People began to cry openly. Women clapped their hands over their mouths. Men wiped their faces without shame. From the crowd, an old woman, one who had once called her cursed, stepped forward holding a calabash of water. She knelt and offered it. "Take, Naim. Let the land and our hearts be clean again." Adaeze accepted, lifted the bowl toward the sky, and poured it gently onto the ground. Drops splashed on the dust like new beginnings. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Everyone looked up and gasped. It was as if heaven itself had been waiting for her forgiveness to breathe again. When she finally spoke to the people, the square fell silent. Her voice carried steady and calm, the kind that makes even the wind listen. "You called me a curse," she said, "but curses don't build roads or schools or hospitals. Fear did not make me strong, love did. The same love my mother showed me when she whispered that I was a miracle. I forgive you all, not because you asked, but because carrying hate would have kept me small." Applause burst out like rainfall. She raised her hand for quiet and continued, "From today, Umuiz will no longer be known for rejection, but for rebirth. We will build together, women, men, and every child who dares to dream." Her team unveiled plans for a new hospital, a literacy center, and a scholarship fund named the Izene Project. As she spoke, elders nodded, youth shouted, "Adaeze, Adaeze." It sounded like both her name and a prayer. She looked toward the old family compound. Through the crowd she saw a woman in faded wrapper, her mother, older but radiant, tears running freely. Adaeze ran to her, forgetting protocol. They embraced tightly, two halves of a miracle finally complete. Cameras flashed, drums roared louder. Even the chief began to dance. The crowd joined in, chanting, "She has returned. She has returned." For the first time in the village's history, joy drowned out superstition. As dusk settled, lanterns glowed across Umuiz. Adaeze stood on the same hill where she had once watched the sky alone. Below her, music rose from the square. Laughter carried on the wind compound. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Mama, thank you, sky." Then she turned to her people and said her final words for the night. "Remember this day. The eyes you feared have seen your future, and it is bright." The crowd cheered until the stars appeared. Somewhere in the heavens, thunder rolled softly, less like warning, more like applause. And that was how the story of the rejected girl became the anthem of a nation. Because sometimes, the ones the world casts out are the very ones sent to heal it. Years passed, and Umuiz was no longer the shadow it used to be. The roads Adaeze promised had been built. The boreholes ran freely. The laughter of schoolchildren now replaced the silence that once haunted the air. At dawn, the marketplace buzzed with trade, and at night, solar lamps glowed like stars scattered on earth. Her foundation reached beyond the region, across towns and states. Her name became a quiet anthem for the forgotten. Yet, even with the weight of success, Adaeze never carried herself like a queen. She still walked through markets greeting traders by name, still knelt to speak with children at their eye level, still paused to pray before every project. She had seen power twist better people into pride, but she had also seen humility rebuild a nation. So she chose humility. And when the world called her Madam Governor, she simply smiled and said, "I'm still Adaeze, the girl who once slept under the sky." One morning, when the air smelled of new rain, Adaeze drove alone to the old part of Umuiz where her childhood home once stood. The compound had changed, the walls freshly painted, the flowers she and her mother planted now tall and wild. At the center stood a small marble stone. As a Neokoro, a mother's love never dies. Adaeze knelt before it, her eyes filling quietly. "Mama," she whispered, "I did what you told me. I showed them that miracles come in strange colors." The wind stirred gently, brushing her hair like a mother's hand. For a long time she stayed there, not as a leader, not as a symbol, but as a daughter whose journey had come full circle. In the distance, she heard the laughter of schoolchildren running past, their uniforms bright, their voices free of fear. One little girl stopped at the gate, her eyes wide and blue as the morning sky. She smiled shyly and waved. Adaeze's heart clenched, not in pain this time, but pride. The cycle had broken. Difference was no longer something to hide. It was something to celebrate. That evening, the village gathered for the annual Festival of Light, an event Adaeze had created to honor resilience. Candles dotted every doorstep, music floated on the wind, and prayers rose for peace. Adaeze sat among the people, no longer on a stage, just one of them. The chief, now old and gray, leaned toward her. "Your eyes once frightened us," he said softly, "but now we see God in them." She smiled. "It was never my eyes, Chief. It was your hearts that learned to see." When the first drumbeat signaled the end of the ceremony, Adaeze stood, lifted her candle high, and said, "Let this light remind us that rejection cannot kill what destiny protects." The crowd repeated her words like a hymn. The sky, deep and endless, seemed to glow brighter as if echoing her prayer. Later that night, as the village slept, Adaeze sat outside her window, pen in hand, finishing a letter she had been writing for months, a message to anyone who might one day feel out of place. "Do not hide your difference," she wrote. "It might be the very thing the world needs to see its own beauty." She folded the note and placed it in her journal. The moon hung above her like an old friend, calm and knowing. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled softly, not in warning, but in applause. And so, the tale of Adaeze, the girl with the sky in her eyes, ended where it began, beneath the same heavens that had once been her only witness. Her story remained on the lips of her people, told again and again as a reminder that sometimes what the world calls a curse is simply the first sign of a miracle. Hey, my Afritales family, thank you for watching till the end. Your love, comments, and support mean the world to me. If you're new here, welcome to the family. Don't forget to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to give you a shout out in my next video. This is Afritales by Sophyjay, where every story carries the heartbeat of Africa.